The fog came in like a trespasser, silent and deliberate, rolling over the fields as if it already knew the land better than the people who lived on it. Folks around here still talk about the moment it crossed the river, how the livestock stopped moving, how the church bell struck once on its own, and how every dog in town hid under porches as though they'd heard a whistle too high for human ears. That was the morning everything began to unravel, the morning the past clawed its way back into the present, refusing to stay buried any longer. You have to understand something, in this part of America, history doesn't lie still. It waits. It watches. And when the fog refused to leave, it was as if it had come back for what it was owed. Old men on front porches said it reminded them of the stories their grandfathers told, the ones spoken in low voices when they thought the children were asleep. About a mist that used to crawl out of the lowlands once every few generations, on the same night people vanished without footprints, without warnings, without even a sound to mark the moment they stopped existing. It had the same weight now, the same unnatural stillness, as if the air itself had thickened with memory. People could see only a few feet ahead, shapes bending and warping at the edge of their vision, but nobody felt truly alone inside it. They all said the same thing, something moved just beyond where the eye could focus. Something patient. In town, the sheriff blamed the river, the factories, the shift in weather patterns no one could explain. But the older families, the ones whose roots ran deep and twisted through this soil, felt something different stirring. Generations of unspoken sins have a scent, and the fog seemed to carry it, a faint metallic tang like iron left out in the rain. Before long, people started hearing things at night, murmurs rising from the cornfields, footsteps on gravel roads that hadn't been walked in decades, names being whispered that no one should have known anymore. And the strangest part was how everyone felt it in their bones, the land wasn't reacting to the fog. The fog was reacting to the land. They say the first disappearance didn't feel like a disappearance at all, more like an erasure. A man named Franklin Yates, third generation on his family's acreage, was out checking the fence line. His wife said she heard his boots on the porch, heard him clear his throat the way he always did after a day in the cold. But when she stepped outside, the sound wasn't his footsteps anymore. It was something slower, dragging, as if the earth itself were exhaling. She called his name, her voice swallowed by the fog, and when it finally thinned enough for her to see the porch boards, she found only his coat, folded too neatly for a man who never folded anything at all. Franklin was gone, and in his place was a faint imprint, like someone had pressed fingers into damp wood. One set of prints, leading into the fog. None leading back. By the next morning, 3 more from the old families had vanished. No breaking of locks, no signs of struggle, not even a lantern left burning. Just empty rooms that felt wrong, like someone had taken something more than the person who lived there. Folks tried to explain it away, maybe they wandered, maybe they ran, maybe they fell in the river. But even the sheriff stopped saying those things after he walked into the Parker house and found the dining chairs stacked in a perfect circle around the table, the biblical family tree chart hung upside down, and a single line carved into the wallpaper behind it, "The fog remembers." No one talked about that carving publicly. But everyone heard about it. And suddenly people started digging through old trunks, pulling out diaries they weren't supposed to read, tracing their bloodlines with trembling hands, looking for the thing they feared most, a connection. Because the fog didn't seem interested in newcomers or drifters. It was choosing people whose families had been here longest, as if it were revisiting a ledger from a century ago, checking names off a list that had never been closed. The pastors said it was judgment. The scientists said it was coincidence. But the old families stopped saying anything at all. They just waited. Listened. Because the fog wasn't lifting. And every hour it stayed, the land felt less like home and more like a mouth that had been waiting to reopen. Rumors spread the way they always do in small towns, quietly, sideways, like something afraid to be overheard by the walls themselves. People claimed the fog wasn't just thick, it was weighted, as though sound moved through it slower, stretched thin, distorted. You'd call out to someone a few yards away, and your own voice would return to you a second too late, carrying a tremor that didn't belong to you. But what unsettled folks most wasn't the sound, it was the way memories started slipping, as if the fog had reached inside their minds and smudged the edges. It happened first to the older residents. A woman stopped in the middle of Main Street, unable to remember whether she'd been coming from the store or heading toward it. A man grabbed his own son by the shoulders, demanding to know who he was, tears in his eyes as though he recognized the face but not the life behind it. And soon it spread further. People forgot birthdays, land deeds, the names of long-buried relatives. Some said they saw faces in the fog that resembled their own bloodlines, ancestors they'd only ever known from brittle photographs. But these faces didn't look preserved in time. They looked hungry. The truth surfaced slowly, reluctantly, the way rot does when the floorboards finally give. Old journals were read aloud in quiet kitchens, family secrets spilled over coffee as if the words themselves had been waiting decades to escape. Disputes over stolen farmland. Betrayals between neighbors. Feuds that ended with bodies never found. The kind of darkness America buries under polite towns and manicured lawns. And in every retelling, the fog crept closer to the windows, as if listening. One story stood out among the rest, an event so old that even the local historians treated it like a legend, the clearing night of 1889. A night when a fog similar to this one rolled in thick as wool, staying for 3 days before lifting to reveal an entire row of homesteads empty. The official record blamed illness, migration, anything except the truth. People whispered only in shadows. Those families had been involved in something unspeakable, something the land itself refused to forgive. And now, more than a century later, the pattern had returned. Same families. Same soil. Same nameless weight settling over the town like a verdict. It wasn't superstition anymore. It was inheritance. And every person with roots deep enough to feel the pull of this place started asking the same quiet question, not aloud, but in the bottom of their gut. What, exactly, did our ancestors do that the fog has come back to collect? As the second week dragged on, the fog stopped feeling like weather and began feeling like a presence, something with memory, intention, and patience older than the town itself. People stopped going out after dark, not because of what they might see, but because of what they might remember. The pastor at St. Mary's claimed he heard voices during evening prayers, not demonic, not divine, but familiar. Like parishioners who died decades earlier, whispering from somewhere just outside the sanctuary doors. He said they spoke in fragments, half-formed confessions, as if the dead were trying to finish sentences left unfinished in life. When he told the congregation, they stopped attending altogether. The strangest part was that the fog didn't behave the same way for everyone. Some people walked through it as if it were nothing more than thick air. Others stepped into it and felt a pressure on their chest so heavy they could barely breathe. A few said the fog showed them things, glimpses of their family past, scenes they had no business knowing, moments that hadn't been recorded in any ledger or passed down in any story. A man digging through his barn found himself reliving an argument between his great-grandfather and a neighbor over a boundary line that was never settled peacefully. A woman swore she saw an ancestor stuffing something into the well behind the house, something shaped like a child's doll but heavier, wrapped in cloth that pulsed like living skin. People tried to rationalize it by clinging to whatever science they could. But you can't explain why the fog formed patterns on windows that resembled family crests. Or why the soil in certain backyards turned the color of dried blood only when someone with the right last name stepped on it. Or why the old oak tree by the courthouse, the one where a group of masked men once delivered their own brand of frontier justice, started weeping sap the exact shade of human tears. At night, you could hear knocking. Not on doors, but beneath them. Floorboards shuddering as though something was moving underneath the houses, tracing the foundations with slow, deliberate steps. And people heard their names spoken softly from vents, from drains, from the gaps under bedroom doors. Not shouted. Not demanded. Just spoken, as if the fog was calling roll. And by then, most folks realized something they'd been trying not to admit: this wasn't an invasion. It was a return. And whatever their ancestors had buried, had finally found its way back to their threshold. Somewhere around the 15th day, the fog stopped pretending it was just mist and began showing its true shape. People described it differently, but the feeling was universal, the sense that something within it had begun to take form, like silhouettes pressing against a curtain. It didn't resemble ghosts or people or anything that once walked this earth. It looked more like memory attempting to grow limbs. More like regret learning how to stand upright. Folks swore they saw movements that mimicked their own posture, their own gait, as if the fog were practicing them, rehearsing them. By then, the disappearances weren't isolated. They came in clusters. A family of 4 gone overnight, all their bed sheets pulled tight, corners folded, pillows still warm. A man found standing in his yard at dawn, staring at the fog with eyes so wide they looked peeled open. When the sheriff touched him, the man collapsed, his body hollow, like everything inside him had been quietly scooped out. They buried him closed casket because his face wouldn't relax. It was frozen in the expression of someone who had seen the truth and couldn't contain the terror of recognizing it. But the most terrifying reports came from those who heard things. Not whispers this time. Not footsteps. But, breathing. Slow, steady, synchronized breathing, rising and falling with the rhythm of an unseen crowd. Some said it came from the treeline, others swore it came from beneath the fields. A few claimed it came from within their own homes, echoing faintly in the walls like an inhalation shared by hundreds of unseen throats. People started to flee. But the fog didn't let them. Cars broke down at the same 3-mile stretch of highway. Tires shredded on gravel smooth as glass. One family tried walking out through the woods and came back to town 3 hours later, clothes soaked, eyes glazed, repeating the same sentence in a monotone loop, "The land won't release us. The land won't release us." And that was when the final truth began to surface, the realization that the fog wasn't hunting them randomly. It was following bloodlines. Tracing ancestry. Targeting those whose families had benefited from old crimes carved into unmarked land. Sins no one living had committed, but everyone living was tied to. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? People always imagine that when the truth finally reveals itself, it arrives like a revelation, sharp, decisive, undeniable. But that's not how it came to this town. The truth seeped in slowly, like water rising beneath floorboards, until one day people realized their memories weren't just being tampered with, they were being rearranged into a story the fog wanted them to remember. A story their ancestors had tried to erase. It began with the journals. Not the ones kept locked in attics or tucked into cedar chests, but the ones no one knew existed, bound in cracked leather, pages brittle, ink faded to the color of dried leaves. They started appearing on doorsteps, windowsills, even inside kitchen drawers that hadn't been opened in years. Every book belonged to a different family, and every book told a similar story: land taken through violence, agreements sealed with threats, disappearances that were never accidents, confessions buried along with bodies that were never given graves. And the fog reacted. When someone tried to burn a journal, the pages refused to catch flame. When a man tore his apart, he found the same entries rewritten on his bedroom wall by morning. A family tried burying theirs behind the barn, only to wake up and find the journal neatly placed in the center of their dining table, open to a page that mentioned their surname and the phrase, "You owe us the rest." People realized then that the fog wasn't just reenacting history. It was retrieving it. One night, no one agrees on the precise hour, a sound rose from the fields. A heavy, rhythmic thudding. Not footsteps, not machinery. More like a heartbeat amplified through the soil. The whole town felt it, like a pulse traveling upward through the foundations of every home. Dogs howled, babies went silent. And when people stepped outside, they saw the fog parting in slow waves, revealing faint outlines moving beneath it. Not bodies. Not spirits. But shapes, abstract, shifting, almost human and yet unmistakably wrong. The kind of shapes that form when memory tries to become flesh. Someone shouted a prayer. Someone else tried firing a shotgun into the fog, and the shot echoed back twice, as though the fog itself had answered. That was the moment the town understood the nature of their inheritance. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't some supernatural reckoning. It was debt collection. The fog wasn't here to harm at random, it was here to return what had been buried. To complete stories that had been cut short. To hand back the weight their ancestors had forced others to carry. And when the fog finally whispered, its voice carried not anger, but recognition. It knew their names because it had held them for generations. By the time the fog reached its final thickness, the town had fallen into a kind of quiet that didn't belong to the living. People spoke less, moved slower, as if every step risked disturbing something beneath their feet. There were no more disappearances, not because the fog had grown merciful, but because it no longer needed to take anyone. It had already gathered what it came for. And what it hadn't taken, it had changed. The survivors felt it first in their dreams. They stopped dreaming of their own memories and instead saw lives they had never lived, men working fields that weren't theirs, women mourning children who bore no resemblance to their families, whole bloodlines suffering in silence as the earth swallowed their names. The dreams didn't fade in the morning. They stuck to the mind like soot, turning every reflection into a reminder, none of us stand on clean ground. Some claimed the fog began to speak more clearly. Not whispers, not breath, but something closer to language, fragmented, broken, like a story being read slowly by someone learning to speak again. It said things like we remember. It said you will carry what was taken. And sometimes, late at night, it asked questions no one wanted to answer. Who do you think paid for your comfort? Whose bones hold up your walls? Whose silence bought your peace? A few people tried to leave again. This time, the fog didn't stop them. Their engines started. Their legs carried them. The highway stayed clear. But those who left returned days later with the same hollow look, muttering that the world outside felt wrong now, too bright, too weightless. Like they'd stepped out of a story they still belonged to. Like the fog had marked them forever. When the fog finally lifted, abruptly, silently, without ceremony, it didn't leave devastation behind. The houses stood. The road stretched on. The fields shimmered in the morning light as though nothing had happened. But something had shifted in the air, in the soil, in the people themselves. The town looked unchanged, but the people no longer recognized their own reflections. They carried faces that seemed older. Shadows that didn't quite match their bodies. And eyes that looked as though they'd seen someone else's memories and couldn't unsee them. What the fog left was not destruction. It left knowledge. A weight so heavy that even the future felt different. And if you visit that town now, if you stand in the stillness and breathe deep, you might catch the faintest trace of metal in the air. A memory of the fog. A reminder that history doesn't stay buried. It waits. It listens. And when it returns, it does so with perfect recollection. Some say the fog never truly left, it only thinned out enough for people to pretend again. Pretend the air didn't still vibrate with unfinished stories. Pretend the silence wasn't full of eyes. Pretend their homes weren't built on bones that had never rested. But the ones who lived through those weeks, they knew better. They could feel the truth shift under their feet every time the wind died. They could sense it in the tremor of their own pulse whenever the night grew too still. After the lifting, the town tried to move forward the way Americans always do, by painting over rot and calling it renovation. Committees were formed. Town halls were held. There was talk of recovery, resilience, and mental health resources, all the words people cling to when they want to disguise fear as progress. But the old families stayed quiet. They walked with their shoulders drawn in, like people waiting to be called back into a room they'd hoped to never enter again. Some began returning the journals to the soil, not burning them, not hiding them, just laying them gently under the earth like offerings. And strangely, the land accepted them. The dirt shifted softly, pulled the journals downward, swallowed them the way it might accept a seed. No one spoke during those moments. They simply stood there, watching as the past sank back into the ground, not erased, but acknowledged. That was the difference. The town learned, finally, that the land does not tolerate forgetting. Children born after the fog carried strange traits, dreams that started too early, instincts they didn't understand, knowledge they couldn't name. Some of them could walk into a room and tell which corners held sorrow, which doors had been closed too long. Elders whispered that the fog had left something behind in their bloodlines, a reminder, a marker. A kind of inheritance you don't pass down so much as live with. Travelers who pass through the town today talk about the odd quiet in the evenings. They mention how the shadows seem longer than they should be, how the air cools too fast after sundown, how the trees sway even without wind. A few say they've seen the fog gather in small patches along the ground, curling and uncurling like something breathing lightly in its sleep. And if you ask the oldest residents what happened during the weeks the fog refused to leave, they'll never give you a full answer. They'll look at you with eyes that hold too many stories, and they'll say something simple, something final. The land remembers. The fog only showed us what it never forgot. And if you ever hear the wind go silent all at once, if the air suddenly tastes metallic, if the horizon begins to blur, you'll understand why they still keep their bags packed by the door. Because history doesn't fade. It waits. It watches. And when it comes back, it brings every name it ever learned.